Hi, and welcome to another episode of Governance Essentials for Justice of the Peace Association. In today's episode, we will focus on a critical aspect of governance, managing conflicts of interest. This is an area that can have serious implications for associations' credibility and effectiveness if not handled properly. I'm Paul Mracek, your host, and today I'm joined by our expert guest, Wendy La Macchia, who will guide us through the challenge of how to identify and manage conflicts of interest effectively for associations. Welcome, Wendy.
Hi, Paul, and welcome to you too. Thanks for having me. So, an interesting topic indeed that we'll talk
Yes,
about today.
it always is that way. So usually a conflict of interest occurs when a board member's personal or professional interests might compromise their ability to act in the best interests of the association. Can you explain how associations can identify potential conflicts of interest from your experience?
Well, conflicts of interest are they're almost like a broad category, if you like. When you think about the Corporations Act and you think about conflict of interest in that context, it's
Mhm.
normally a financial conflict of interest where you might have a board director, for example, who is on the board of another organization, or you might have a board director with, in investments or shareholdings in another organization that impacts on their ability to make those independent decisions. So I guess in a private corporation context, they're often easier to identify, but in associations, especially where the majority of them have volunteer boards, and often those boards are brought in sometimes because of their connections, that might be business connections that they have, but they're often volunteers. And so they don't see themselves as having that kind of financial interest. Their interest in the organisation tends to be more around its purpose and the reason why it exists. So identifying conflicts of interest can be a little bit more challenging. Sometimes it can be on the basis of membership of other organisations or membership of other associations. It can be on the basis of family relationships. It can be on the basis of social relationships. We talked about, say, for example, if an association was thinking of moving its office, and
Mm.
the ethical decision making that might go around that. It's conceivable that you could have a situation where one of the directors says, well, I own an office in a commercial building and I'd be happy to rent it to you, for example. And whilst that seems to be a quick and ready solution, when the board comes to making a decision as to whether to take up that offer, they really do need to make sure that it's fair. And so they're not sort of just doing something because it's convenient, for example. So conflicts of interest, I think that there's kind of two ways of identifying them. So it could be inherent in, say, membership of other organisations. Say, for example, with Justice of the Peace associations, you might be a member of a political party, for example. That could be relevant. And so that should be declared. You're not expected to declare all of your financial interests, but I think it's mainly kind of relationships and things like that. So, you might also declare that you are a member of that association, or you might declare that you provide services to the association under some kind of a business contract. So they're the kind of things that are
Mm.
long-standing conflicts of interest that are probably easier to identify.
Yeah, we have in the association that I'm involved with, we have a regular one where we say, what businesses, because most people have got their own businesses in a lot of cases, whether it's family related business or something else, and just needed to say, I'm a director on this other business, and this is the type of
Yeah.
business it has to do, and that we don't see that there is any conflict, or yes, there may be potential conflict for that. And of course, most JP associations are not flushed with funds at the best of time. So they are dependent upon people providing in-kind services. And that situation where you said we've got a location that you may be able to rent at a rate that can have some big ramifications to it because it can be perceived or taken the wrong way in a number of different ways, whether it's from the ASIC or ATO or for whatever, if you don't
Yeah.
necessarily do it at a market value. All right, well, thank you for that. And I suppose the next part of that is once a conflict of interest is identified, what steps should be taken to manage it effectively? We just started touching on that, but what other things should
Yeah, I think it's really good practice at the beginning of or at the opening of your board meetings to ask the directors there if there are any matters on the agenda where there could be a conflict of interest. So, as I said, you can have obvious conflict of interest or potential conflict of interest because of those associations and relationships, but sometimes it could be a matter that comes up for discussion where you could have a conflict of interest. What it's looking at is, is your ability to make an objective decision going to be impaired by biases that you might already hold? It's not to say that that is going to happen, but it's really about transparency so that if it's ever called into, you can say, well, we did discuss that matter at the board meeting. At the beginning of the board meeting, we asked for any potential conflicts of interest in the agenda items. And whilst we were making that decision, that person recused themselves from the decision-making process. So that is the kind of transparency that you're looking for. So that's one way to manage a conflict of interest that will come up out of an agenda item. Another way to really be on top of any potential conflicts of interest is to have, what it might be a disclosure register that you have that you need to keep up to date as well. And that could be particularly with volunteer boards. It could be, like I said, it could be memberships of other associations. It could be memberships of political parties. It could be your employment, or it could be any business type relationship that you have with the organisation. So you keep a register of those kind of interests. And so the two things that you should do at the beginning of the board meeting is also to ask if there's any updates to that disclosure register, any updates needed. And it should be included in the board pack, the latest copy of the register. And also if there's any potential conflicts with any of the agenda items for that particular board meeting. So it's really about how this looks rather than implying that you couldn't possibly be unbiased in this decision because of X. It's really about how this looks. So it's not sort of establishing that director can't participate in that decision making. It's establishing that there may be some. It's not sort of implying that there's bad things or inappropriate decisions going to be made. It's really just about ensuring that you've got that transparency in the way that this looks to outsiders and to your members is absolutely by the book, if you like.
Do you find that having the registrar, there's a habit in a number of organisations I've seen that they do the review once a year? Is it a once a year thing or is it once a board meeting thing? Does it devalue it if you do it on a more frequent basis for it?
I think that things can be quite dynamic. So I think it's always worth having as a standing item on your board meeting agenda. As part of your meeting administration. So your meeting administration is who's present, apologies, minutes of the last meeting, and then your two items would be the disclosure register and if there are any conflicts of interest right at the beginning of the meeting. So I think that whilst you can have a register that you might put together when you've, say, just had a board election, you should check on that every board meeting as well, because like I said, things are dynamic. People change jobs, they change positions, they are no longer members of associations or they become members of an association. It's always best to just have that quick check at the beginning of your board meeting. It's not a time-consuming process. It's very quick. It kind of ticks that off that you've done that. It also focuses attention just for that brief time on conflict of interest and disclosure of interest.
I wonder sometimes whether it's out of sight, out of mind, where it's not discussed, then people sort of just tend to do their normal thing and it doesn't come into the psyche of the thinking process. So bringing it up is not such a bad idea.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose that takes us to the next point in terms of once you see a conflict of interest, what are the potential consequences of not managing those conflicts of interest or when they're done poorly, and how can associations avoid these pitfalls?
Okay, so the consequences could be a challenge by your members. I think that, especially with justice of the peace associations or voluntary boards, you're not as likely to be, taken to court by a shareholder, for example. That's a very extreme consequence in a corporate kind of environment. But I think the consequences for volunteer boards and for not-for-profits and justice of the peace associations is that if you make a decision that goes a bit awry, for example, The consequences are that you're going to need to be transparent to your members about it. And I think we talked about that in one of the other
We did.
podcasts. So you're going to need to be transparent to your members. You're going to say, we made this decision and it went horribly wrong. So you're transparent for a start. So your members know that you've made that decision. If it then arises that there was the existence of a conflict of interest, then your decision making is going to be called into question. And so that kind of presents a kind of reputational risk, if you like. And the last thing you want to do is lose the trust of your members, because your members, you want them to trust you to make good decisions. So I think that's where the consequences are. It's not to say that you can never do anything with a party that there is a relationship with. It's just to say that you want to be right across that transparency, and you want to make sure that your decision making is sound and it's not biased. So everything needs to be kind of minuted. So one of the ways that you might manage a conflict, let's go back to the scenario where you're thinking of moving your office premises, and one of the directors on the board happens to have, an investment in a commercial property that has office space in it. So thinking about that scenario, clearly when it comes to choosing whether or not you're going to take up that office location, that director should probably recuse themselves from that decision because of that. They would kind of benefit financially to the organisation renting that premises. So they should use themselves from that decision. It's a hard word to pronounce. So, and the way that you would manage that then is that you would look at two other properties, all right? So that you want to make sure that the amount of rent and the terms of the lease are fair and reasonable and at arm's length and are at kind of commercial rates, if not better. So you can then say, well, we looked at property A, property B, and property C, and you've kind of debated the ins and outs of the location and the facilities and things like that. And the terms of the leases are the same. The rents are the same. You may get better rent from one of the properties. And so the board then might make that decision to go with the cheaper rent. So that's how you kind of handle a conflict of interest in that sort of scenario. So it's again saying that, property A happens to be the one where you've got a director who has a financial interest in, but it also happens to have the best contract terms and it happens to have the best rent cost. You may go with that, but that person should step aside from making that decision and influencing that decision, because you've gone to the trouble of comparing other properties. It hasn't been the only one that you've considered, that you have actually looked at others, and your decision making is fine. I guess the consequences, if that kind of goes horribly wrong, you can say, well, we did it this way, we executed proper decision making, and we avoided that conflict of interest. So hopefully that kind of answers your question in a long roundabout way.
It does, and it comes back to a couple of points from that, was that it comes back to the fact about transparency as well as traceability, and as we've talked about before, that it needs to be clear. And it's easy to find yourself in a difficult situation where that can be questioned because you don't have that clear perspective of what you've done. I think in a number of cases, people will say, oh, great, we've got this great opportunity to do this, and they don't bother to go and get in another alternative quote or a couple of quotes associated with it. That also can create problems for you because people are not in that discussion. They're only looking external, and of course that looks bad for what they're doing. And I think the other thing that you've got is that you quite often see so many positions being advertised, whether it's through the AICD or through LinkedIn or whatever, for looking for directors for non-for-profits and stuff. They're looking just to get people to try and get on those boards. You have to wonder whether they're doing a proper selection process for that, which can get them caught out. And then that could be potentially, I know someone for this reason, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're the best fit for that because you happen to know them. And what was the basis for getting them in? Was it to fit a particular requirement within the association, or was it because they were friend X, Y, Z of a certain person? I think those things are certainly need to be considered considered. And that's where your culture and how you handle those things are necessary. And the other thing I find is that people hate conflict.
Mm.
So they try to do all sorts of things to ignore it, and hopefully it'll disappear rather than addressing it and bringing it up and making sure that they've got proper
Yeah,
response to what the situation was
yeah.
for it. So yes, good. Thank you for that. Like most things, we can go on and talk about these things forever about what we're talking about, but we're sort of getting to our time. I was just going to ask a general question. Is there any specific points from a conflict of interest, that additional things that we haven't covered, that you think is worth noting or mentioning to for our listeners, that maybe they need to consider when they're in a board position from a conflict of interest from your experience?
I think sometimes there could be a perceived conflict of interest that is not 100% apparent, which is why you would also consider the items on the agenda and the decisions that the board are going to make ahead of you as to whether there could be perceived bias in your decision making. But I think the thing to remember too is that it doesn't stop someone from participating in that decision making, because it could well be that someone has recused themselves from or declared a conflict of interest, but the rest of the board decide that okay, they're aware of that, but they're going to accept that, but that person can still take part in the decision making. I think that's an important point to remember. It doesn't necessarily exclude that person, it just brings it out into the open.
Yeah, I think that's the key, so that it's not festering somewhere and people are then wondering about it.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you as usual for your time for today and your experience in providing and explaining the importance of identifying managing conflicts of interest from a governance point of view for, in our case, justice of peace associations. And certainly by implementing clear policies, which is what we're talking about, and fostering an environment of transparency, justice of the peace associations can effectively mitigate these risks and maintain the trust of their members and their stakeholders. I mean, that's the key. I mean, if you're a member association and you lose your members, then you don't have an association anymore, do you? I
Well,
mean,
that's true. And
and the
Justice and Peace Associations, more than other organisations, we have to have integrity all the time. We have to have
yeah,
it
yeah.
on 100% of the time. We have to exercise integrity, and I think conflict of interest is one of those aspects of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. A number of times I've had, probably over the course of the last 12 months, a number of people say to me, "Oh, can I pay you for that?" Or, I feel guilty for giving you the time. And they're always blown away and say, "No, it's a free service we provided to you because we're providing to the community." Yeah, but it's your time. And they really want to try
Yeah.
and do it. And I think, once you start down that slippery slide, it's the best. And I was going to make a
Yes.
mention that there's two cases that come to mind that it's not necessarily a conflict of interest, but it's down that way. And that was one was on the Qantas board where they had people having to leave because of perceived interest issues that was in there and value for the money. And the other one was the Woolworths board where the CEO ended up having to resign because of comments made and he lost the trust. And I think the issue was maybe there was some conflict of interest in his words. He was biased in the
Yeah.
conversation and the words that he was saying.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can see some good examples of that happening in the profit
In
organizations where you see that
yeah.
going on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And organisations have never been more under scrutiny than than they are now, especially very large household name type organisations. So every organisation needs to be thinking along those lines that they need to be.
All the time. That's
They
true.
need to exercise that integrity. So,
Well, once again, thank you. And also thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Governance Essentials. And in our next episode, we'll be looking at volunteer management and engagement to maximize impact with a focus on the best practices for managing and engaging volunteers, something that's always a difficult one, as we both know.
yes,
Until then, stay vigilant and managing conflicts of interest in your association, and bye for now.
thank you.